Yo ho ho, and a cheery Christmas welcome to my review of The Chimes by Charles Dickens, a book that is actually about the new year. The Chimes was released in 1844, the year after the Christmas Carol, and was Dickens' attempt to recapture that same lightning. You can find my review of the Christmas Carol on this very channel. Who knows, with this being Christmas, I may even remember to put a link in the description. As usual, the plot description can be skipped by sliding the timer to the point indicated on your screen, and as usual, none of the rest of the video should be considered spoiler-free either. Now, the story follows Trotty, so named because of his speedy, trot-like gait, who works as a ticket porter. Basically, he delivers messages and anything else he can carry for a small fee. Trotty starts the book sheltering from the weather while waiting for a job, while musing on the lot of the poor according to the doctrines of the wealthy. He also listens to the church bells, who he considers to be something like companions, occasionally reading messages into their noise. His daughter arrives with her boyfriend Richard, and Trotty's lunch, some tripe as it turns out. Together, they tell Trotty that they intend to get married on New Year's Day. Trotty has some minor misgivings, but nothing like as many as the three wealthy patrons of Trotty's, who are happy to share their wisdom, if not their money or their lunch. They tell Meg she has no business being married because she isn't wealthy enough, and that if she ignores their advice, her soon-to-be husband will make her life miserable before turning out bad, and his terrible example will also make their children turn out bad. They then also tell Richard that he ought to be out doing manly stuff and not settling down with a girl. One of the rich people, Alderman Cute, sends Trotty off with a message for Sir Joseph Bowley, an MP living locally. The letter is read aloud in Trotty's company, and he learns a man named Will Fern is considered a vagabond, and that Alderman and the MP are discussing which punishment for him is most suitable. They decide on a jail sentence. Trotty, returning home, coincidentally bumps into Fern and offers him and his daughter a place to stay for the night. This will enable Fern to avoid meeting the Alderman and getting sent to prison. He learns that after hearing the Alderman's opinion on the poor, that Meg and Richard have called off their wedding. Hearing the bells ringing in the town, Trotty decides to climb the church in order to hear them better. He witnesses a vision of the spirits of the bells going out into the town, attaching themselves to the people and influencing them for good or ill. Sort of like Dickens invented Thetans before Hubbard. Trotty then sees himself lying dead on the floor of the church, and the bell's spirit tells him that he has slipped and fell and is now dead. They criticise him for giving up on humanity and believing the bad things that the likes of the Alderman has said. The spirit of Fern's daughter, Lillian, takes him through some visions of the present, which is the future, if you like, because it's 9 years after his death. Lillian, Fern's daughter, and previously a vision of innocence, is now on the game. Meg is now a spinster, alone and refusing to accept Lillian's money. She's scraping a desperate living. She is, however, reconciled with Lillian, who inexplicably dies immediately afterwards. The spirit skips forward a few years, and Fern is in front of the magistrates complaining about his miserable life of petty crime and how being known as a petty criminal by all is making life harder and harder. Meg is now even more desperate. She has married Richard, but he has turned out, as prophesied, to be a bad un, an alcoholic. He married her only hoping that it would improve his lot. His demons, though, have proved stronger, and he's destroyed Meg as well, leaving her alone with the baby. She depends on the charity of Mrs. Chickenstalker, landlady and shop owner, but Chickenstalker's new husband, the one-time porter of the MP Bowley, hates the charity that his wife gives Meg and criticises Meg for taking it. Distraught, Meg prepares to commit suicide and infanticide by jumping into the river, but Trotty discovers that he still has the power to intervene, and his physical contact with Meg prevents her jumping. He then wakes up. Meg blames his visions on the tripe, neglecting to say that she brought the man prepared it for him, and the author then asks, was Trotty dreaming or not? The story is split into four quarters that mirrors the structure of the previous year's Christmas Carol. Trotty's flight from vision to vision mirrors Scrooge's journey, particularly in terms of their structure, with the Ghost of the Christmas Past, where the visions are more fleeting and perhaps a touch more narrative. What is not mirrored from the carol is any degree of the subtlety that's on show there. Trotty stands alone, considering if the poor are as bad as the commentators in the newspapers seem to say. Would the world be better off without them? A particularly pertinent question, given that Trotty's occupation as a ticket porter would have been under threat in Dickens' time, and would be all but gone a few years after this book was published. He is, if valued by occupation alone, redundant and unnecessary, his miserable lot compounded by his age. In terms of arguing for helping the poor, which the book does throughout, it's an interesting choice compared to something like a farmer, for example, somebody doing a job that is unlikely to ever go unneeded. In terms of the logos, it's harder to see the message, but then this eccentric old man in his dying occupation isn't a great appeal to pathos either. Meg is, of course, the Dickensian model of femininity, the angel of domesticity, even bringing Trotty's food to work. In the first quarter, it's one of the stronger pieces of messaging. Trotty's choices for lunch aren't this meal or that, it's over which set of coal steps to sit on when eating. The alderman and friends intervene, lecturing all three of Trotty, Meg and Richard in the mode of the spokesman of the day. Alderman Cute is based on an actual historical figure who is claimed to be able to speak to the poor in their own language, but in Dickens's satire, this means he just likes the sound of his own voice a little too much. He's joined by the utilitarian Filer and an unnamed third person who represents the New England Brigade, looking back with nostalgia at a British past that Dickens considered a myth. These two are Alderman Cute's willing audience, and between the three of them they contrive to criticise Trotty's lunch for its inefficiency and morality, as well as eating the last of it. It's hardly subtle, but one hopes that, given Trotty's tripe-blamed dreams, the alderman has a rough night of it as well. Their intervention is a thoroughly miserable one, and punctures the little good cheer that the destitute family had found through their games over Trotty's lunch. Dickens is working overtime to create that cheer, and it shows, whereas the market scene in The Christmas Carol is effortless and poignant. Trotty is a dull protagonist, and the chimes of bells are harder to warm to than the more universal joy of Christmas for the family. The novel's plot is crying out for both a Tiny Tim to inject a little more pathos and a Mr. Fezziwig to inject a little cheer. Hitting only one beat makes for a much less interesting tune. Meg's misery, the corruption of Lillian, the fact that the alderman's prophecy about Meg and Richard comes true, admittedly because he made it, one for the philosophers out there probably, it all adds up pretty quickly, and the one moment that might have provided a contrast, the rush of the spirits out into the city when the bells ring, is specifically ambiguous, with some of the spirits attaching themselves to people for good and some for bad. He saw them kind, he saw them cruel, he saw them soothing people in their dreams, he saw them beating them with knotted whips. Even the belfry, the source of all this, in part Trotty's guide and in part his judge, is described as a lonely place full of dread and terror. It's a phenomenal scene of the kind that probably only Dickens can do this well, but it's a shadow of the best moments of The Christmas Carol. The ambiguity in the market scene, for example, is that there is such an abundance that the contrast, the desperate hunger, doesn't need to be spoken. It goes of its own, if you like, from the previous scenes. The Chimes has none of that subtlety, and the message becomes heavy-handed and repetitive. There's a simplicity to the ghosts of the past, present and future that's lost in the Chimes, who take 2 pages to explain Trotty's errors. Who hears in us the chimes, one note bespeaking disregard or stern regard of any hope or joy or pain or sorrow of the many sorrowed throng? Who hears us make response to any creed that gauges human passions and affections as it gauges the amount of miserable food on which humanity may pine and wither? Does us wrong, that wrong you have done us. If Scrooge had gone wrong by simply valuing money over people, what Trotty has done wrong is that he's heard the bells ringing and associated them with the more mundane concerns of the utilitarian, those nostalgic for a more feudalistic or autocratic past, or those who don't care about those who have fallen into sin or other difficulties. These 3 errors are represented by the alderman and his retinue. Filer is the utilitarian, calling Trotty a thief for his inefficiently farmed tripe. The third man is a young Englander, harking back to a past that Dickens lambasts as a cry of lamentation for days which have had their trial and failure and have left deep traces of it which the blind may see. Between them, Alderman Cute and Sir Joseph Bowley are the judgmental authority figures, dictatorial and self-styled, friend and father of the poor, who have precisely zero compassion or understanding of those people. Trotty's mistake is in listening to those people, perhaps even in a weak moment, to believe some of what they have to say, but also to ascribe to the chiming bells some degree of confirmation. Naturally, this is Dickens, and if not peak Dickens, it remains beautifully written. The introduction carries much much of the charm of the same part of the carol, but the cynic in me wants to call it a tribute act, albeit a good one. The goblins bursting out of the bells is probably the novel's finest moment, but the scene where Meg runs to the river with the intention of killing herself captures her insanity and Trotty's desperation pretty well. This part, personifying the winter night as a brooding, ghostly shadow lit with torches, luring the despairing to death, is a great mix of assonance, meter, repetition and caesura to capture the mania and draw it down to a last lingering and desperate darkness. These Christmas novellas were intended to be read out loud, of course. Find this section from the fourth quarter and try it for yourself. It's incredible. In conclusion, The Christmas Carol was and remains a staggering success. The problem was that with the bootleg copies and the unofficial adaptations on stages across the country, the only person disappointed with the amount of money they made from it was Charles Dickens. As such, this attempt to recreate the same snowflake, to put that lightning in a bottle, was never ever going to match its predecessor. Instead, it feels like a retread, a lower quality facsimile. It has its moments, but overall it lacks the warmth and the heart of the original, not to mention the subtlety. The supposed was he dreaming or not question in the final paragraph is simply another excuse for another sermon. The message here is overt and repeated more than often enough without it. Trotty, the soon-to-be redundant messenger, is far less likeable than Scrooge, who has a far clearer journey from bad to good. By contrast, Trotty goes from clueless to slightly less clueless. The novel lacks that contrast of the highs and lows of Scrooge's journey. Meg's final mad dash to death is an extraordinary piece of writing, and if the novel had a moment as powerful to contrast with that, then The Chimes would be so much the better for it. The Chimes is, as it is, very decent. Dickens is never less, but this one is disappointing anyway. So now I've criticised Charles Dickens, you ought to like and subscribe if you want to hear me complaining about William Shakespeare's book about the Easter Bunny.